Hello, everyone, and welcome to our lecture on Chapter 12, Entering and Coding Qualitative Data. So you'll notice that the second half of Chapter 12 covers analyzing qualitative data. I want to let you know that we're not going to be covering that part of Chapter 12 in this lecture because we're going to be covering that material in Chapter 6 when we talk about analyzing both qualitative and quantitative data. So let's get started into how to enter and code qualitative data. So, conceptually, qualitative information is handled in the same way as quantitative information, but some adjustments must be made because the data are not delivered in an immediately quantifiable form like they are in quantitative data research. So, in quantitative data, your data is automatically sometimes put into a number format where it's like, oh, how many drinks do you have on a typical week? And it's a number. That's quantifiable. Qualitative data isn't delivered in that same form. It's not automatically quantifiable. So the data can sometimes come in the form of objects or words that must be converted to numbers or words before it can be analyzed. And by its very nature, qualitative information will seldom be represented by numbers, but can still be systematic and well organized. So that's where entering and organizing qualitative data comes into play, is converting and transferring that information into a systematic organization that gives it some amount of quantifiable nature. And in addition to the raw information that's accumulated when conducting a study, it's essential for you as a researcher to create a separate file of various records, including how many interviews, case studies, or observations were conducted, when and where the data collection took place, and other information about the participants in the studies. It's important for you as a researcher to also collect basic information like the date, time, location, the duration of the event, and the participant observations or characteristics, because all of this information could become important in the data that you're going to end up running in a qualitative study. So it's important to keep all of this information and to create a separate record file for each of these pieces of information so that you can search for that information easily moving forward. One of the first key pieces of entering, cleaning, and organizing qualitative data is transcription. So, transcribing is the process where the recording of an interview or a focus group or other recorded materials from a qualitative study are turned into written words. And there are various dictation applications and software programs that can help with the transcription process. Some of those include In Vivo, which is a software that costs money. You have to have a license to do it, like you have to pay for a user's license. There's also Google Voice, Transcribe Me, and even things like Microsoft Teams can have a transcription service. And as a researcher, you need to include everything that is heard in an interview. That includes grammatical errors, mispronunciations, and even background noise, because all of this information could be vital to the interpretation of the data in providing the data in context. So, transcription can be this really tedious component of qualitative data research, but it's this vital piece of being able to transfer the information that you gathered in interviews into some quantifiable form. We also have the importance of taking notes while you're engaging in qualitative research. And oftentimes we call this memoing. Memoing is when you are taking notes on what you are thinking as you read and reread the transcribed interviews that you've engaged in. And this process allows you as a researcher to really facilitate the later analysis that you're going to be doing on the transcribed material because it brings you closer to the written material. So when you're doing a memo, this is your written expression of what you're experiencing when you're reading through a transcribed interview. So you've already transcribed your qualitative data and you're reading through it as a researcher, and you're making little notes in the corner of your reactions or of possible themes, and that's your memo. And these memos can create patterns, can reveal patterns in the things that you're observing in the community that you're in, that you are investigating. And the researcher in this case will rely on these memos or written expressions that were collected during the analysis to look for these consistencies or repeated thoughts and ideas. And these written expressions reveal those patterns in both the data and in the researcher's thought process. Classification of memos is a process that oftentimes happens after you've written your memos in free thinking style. So you don't go into memo writing with any sort of agenda, you just sort of write it down. But after you have written down your memos, there are 3 common memo types that appear. One of those is theoretical memos, which relate to a theory or make connections between the narrative and theoretical concepts that are related to your data. So an example of this might be making a memo comment or making a note that someone's mistake while speaking is related to the Freudian theory of slips. So you're drawing a connection to theory. We also have self-reflection memos, and these memos connect the narrative of what's going on in the transcribed interview with past experiences. Or sometimes these self-reflection memos simply note how the researcher perceives the written information. So this might be an example of, while you're reading through a transcribed interview, you make a comment that says, "I don't think I would have ever done that, but I grew up in a different culture than this person." So it's this self-reflection of the differences that are occurring, but also connecting the narrative to past experiences. And finally, we have hypothetical memos, and these memos propose or predict a relationship between different parts of the narrative, though when these memos are taken, it is still too early to come to a conclusion. So an example might be, as you are reading through a transcribed interview, maybe the interview, once it's transcribed, is about 10 pages long. And on page 2, you as a researcher engage in a hypothetical memo when you write something like, "I wonder if this will be a theme for the entire interview." It's too early to say that that's the conclusion because you're on page 2 of 10, but you're still making this hypothetical memo. Another piece that can be helpful in entering and organizing qualitative data is diagrams. And diagrams are not only useful for record keeping, but they can also lead to a systematic and organized view of our data. So it gives you an opportunity to visualize the data in a way that makes sense, that's systematic, that's organized, in addition to just being general record keeping. There are various software programs that allow researchers to create a range of diagrams that can be simple, like the one that I'm showing you here, or they can be complex, depending on the needs of the research project. So where you see this simple diagram that might just break down and organize the data that we are sort of developing or sort of trying to understand, this is a simple example of a diagram. You can also get really complex diagrams, such as this one, created by Giorgia Lupi on the length and location of underground transportation options available in Europe. So you can see there's quite the range of these diagrams that you can use to visualize your data in different ways while also organizing it and systematically understanding it in different ways. And finally, coding is one of the ways that we bring order to the written information that we gather in qualitative data. And this process of coding involves labeling and categorizing data in a way that makes sense to us. So the word code is what we use to describe a word or a few words that capture common meaning or categorization. So if you have an interview that you are reading through, it's been transcribed, you're reading through it, you might have a code to indicate something that is a common theme. So anytime that someone makes a comment about food, you have a specific code word for it that says food. So anytime they list a type of food or a thought about food, you just put the word food. That's an example of a code. And the process of coding involves aggregating the text or visual data into small categories of information, seeking evidence for the code from different databases being used in a study, while also then assigning a label to that code. So when you're aggregating text, you're averaging it out. You're looking for a way to find averages amongst the information. And then those averages let you move the information into categories, and then you can assign labels to those categories that will then make it easier for you to understand the data. And there are different types of coding that you can engage in. The first of those is in vivo coding, which occurs when you code word per word as written in text. So there is a specific code for each type of word, and you just code as you see it. You also have pre-existing codes. And these are codes that you have determined before you ever read transcribed material. And you've created these pre-existing codes based on literature, based on research that you have expected or that you have read that tells you what to expect in the interview that you're about to read. So you create these pre-existing codes that you will then apply to the information that you're reading. We also have theoretical coding, which is a set of structured codes, usually from a theoretical perspective of the study. And the text is further examined with little flexibility to add other interpretations. So you're going into coding with some pre-existing ideas of the literature, but specifically in the context of the theory that you're going to be using to explain the data. And you're only using those codes. You're not going to deviate from that theoretical code. That is what you are going to use. We also have content analysis, which is a type of qualitative analysis where the frequencies of certain types of words or certain words are used in a text and then are examined. So in this type of coding, you're looking for count frequencies. So how many times did someone talk about different types of food? How many times did someone make a judgment that was erroneous to the situation? You're looking for that content analysis by looking at frequencies. You can also code by looking for patterns, and this is the identification and grouping of similarities and differences in codes. You can also engage in interpretation, which is the process of going from simple codes to patterns and themes within text. So going beyond simple patterns and saying what it could possibly mean. And finally, you can also have themes, which are broader groups into which categories of memos are gathered, such as a general theme around attention to detail among all participants in a study that is on a particular topic. So noticing these general themes about the entire group. And the organization that we use for coding qualitative data sets us up for how we choose to analyze that same data. And we're going to discuss more of that analyzing of qualitative data in our lecture during week 6. So that is where we're going to wrap up our lecture on chapter 12. I will see you all in the next lecture.